The next thing we're going to talk about is stories as artwork, or as visual artwork. So stories as pictures. And like we were saying before, storytellers, when they tell stories, generally are talking about the pictures in our imaginations. And then we tell the stories and help an audience member paint a picture in his or her imagination. And so that's what storytellers are doing all the time. There are a couple of things that can help you be more effective in doing that. One is to use lots and lots of sensory details. So when you think about human beings, what sense do we tend to use most when we're doing activities?
Hands.
The action part, I mean, you know, when you're describing something, I guess, I'm sorry.
Sight.
Yeah, sight, definitely. We're visual creatures, and so humans use their sense of sight a whole lot. That's why our road signs are visual signs, not smell signs. If we were all dogs or wolves, our signs would all be smell. But we're not, we're human beings, we use our eyes all the time. And so when you tell your story, I'm willing to bet most of you are using lots of visual details for your story. You're describing things by how they look. But one way to make your story even more interesting for an audience is to make sure you add extra details that go beyond sight. So you could be talking about the sounds the characters are hearing, maybe the smells or the tastes. Taste and smell are actually really connected. If you ever get a chance to do this, if you have garlic salt at home, plug your nose and then get a spoonful of garlic salt and taste it. And if your nose is plugged, all you taste is the salt. You don't taste the garlic at all. And then when you release your nose, suddenly you'll smell it, and then it'll taste like garlic. Because most of our sense of what we think of as our sense of taste is really our sense of smell. That's why I remember as a kid people saying, if you don't like vegetables, pinch your nose and eat them, they'll taste better. I don't know if that's really true. I tell that to my daughter too, and she eats her vegetables, so I guess it works. But so sense of taste, and of course the last one we don't often think about a whole lot is your sense of touch. And we usually think of sense of touch being your hands, because that's where the most touch receptors are on our body, is our fingers, one of the places where most of the receptors are. But actually your whole skin covering your entire body is a sense of touch sensory organ. And so if you're feeling hot, if you're feeling cold, that's a sense of touch detail. If you're feeling the wind blowing on you, that's a sense of touch thing. And just by adding some more of these other sensory details, it'll make the story more exciting and more interesting for your listeners. And I'll give you an example of how to do this. With animals, it's actually relatively easy to add sensory details. So for instance, a long time ago, there was a beaver. And she woke up one morning and she swam out of her beaver lodge and climbed up onto the shore and found a tree to cut. And she was chomping and chomping and chomping, and as she was chomping, she was sort of looking up at the sky and she saw a gray cloud go over. And she thought to herself, I wonder if that cloud's going to bring rain. And if it brings rain, I wonder if it's going to bring a flood. And if it brings a flood, I wonder if it's going to wash out our dam. And if it washes out our dam, I wonder if it's going to wash away my children. And as Mother Beaver was thinking about all the things that might possibly happen if it actually rains, she wasn't paying attention to what she was doing. And as she was chewing, she chewed through the tree and suddenly, crack! The tree started to fall right toward Mother Beaver. She turned and she tried to run away, but the tree came down and smack right on her tail. She was trapped. She tried to pull and pull and pull, but her tail was stuck. And then she smelled it. Now to you or me, it would smell kind of like a combination of perfume and gasoline. But to a beaver, it only meant one thing: a wolf. And wolves love to eat beavers for dinner. So she knew she had to get out of there fast. She dug her claws into the ground, she wrinkled up her nose, she pulled and pulled and pulled, and slide! Out came that tail. And she ran on those stubby little beaver legs as fast as she could till she dove, splash, right into the water. But as she hit the water and began diving underwater, she heard a second slapping sort of noise. She thought, that's kind of weird. She came back up to the surface, and she could see a wolf sitting on the shore. She dove back down, and suddenly, that slap happened once again. She thought, that's really strange. So she swam to her lodge, and as she climbed up inside her lodge, she could see that her husband was still sound asleep. Husband, husband, I had such a strange day. I was cutting down a tree, and I saw this cloud, and I thought it might rain. If it might rain, it might flood. If it floods, it might break our dam, and if it breaks our dam, my children might be washed away. And while I was thinking about all that, a tree fell over, and it caught my tail, and then a wolf came, and I had to dive into the water and made a really funny noise. But about halfway through that story, Mother Beaver got that feeling that a lot of wives get when they're not quite sure their husbands are paying attention. He was staring instead at her tail. "What happened to your tail?" he said, and she turned around, and sure enough, where she had had a nice round furry tail like a fox earlier that morning, her tail was now flat as a pancake, and all the fur had been rubbed right off. "Great," said Mother Beaver. "Look at my ugly tail." But Father Beaver, he's a pretty smart guy. He said, "Wait a minute, you said there was a funny noise when you dove. I think I know what's going on. Follow me." And Father Beaver dove down into the water entrance of their lodge and swam underwater to a wide part in the pond. And then he said, "Okay, now while I'm watching, dive." And Mother Beaver, she dove down, and as she dove, that flat tail hit the water and slap. When she came back up, Father Beaver told her what he had seen. "Great! A tail that's ugly and noisy." But Father Beaver, he's a pretty smart guy. He said, "Wait a minute. You're always saying how hard it is to warn our children when there's danger. Now you don't have to. All you got to do is slap that tail, and they'll know to hide." And that's the way it is to this day. If you go and find a beaver pond somewhere, and you're sneaking up on it, and the beaver sees or hears or most likely smells you coming, you'll hear a slap on the water, and you won't see any beavers. Because the children have learned that's a time to hide. But to this day, since Mother Beaver invented this little trick, when Mom slaps her tail, everybody hides. When Dad slaps, everybody looks around. And that's the end of the story. So there's an example of a smell detail I added in. Now, I didn't know, since nobody knows, exactly what a wolf would smell like to a beaver. And so I thought of something that would seem logical. In this case, it was something that would smell kind of sweet and kind of dangerous. So perfume and gasoline seemed like a good combination. Now, once again, you don't have to worry about what it might actually smell like to those animals, because they don't talk, but what would feel right to you. So if I said, it smelled like flowers, that doesn't quite feel right. It doesn't feel that a beaver would smell a wolf and smell flowery sort of smells. It has to be something a little more dangerous, and so that's why I chose perfume and gasoline. Animals also can sometimes give you a sense of taste details. If they're eating some kind of fruit or something, their sense of taste is much more developed than ours. But a lot of times with animal stories, it's easier to get in some of those sensory detail pieces. But in addition to smell, anybody notice other sensory details I added in there?
The clapping?
Yeah, the noise. Now either making a bang noise or a splash, those sorts of things add in those auditory sounds. Whether it's an onomatopoeia, sort of a bang sort of thing, or those other pieces that get you to imagine what's going on. Sure. Any questions about adding sensory details to your stories? The next piece we're going to add is poetic language. And adding poetic language is probably the one piece of the workshop that doesn't happen all by itself. Most of these techniques, even if you don't work on them, the act of telling stories over and over again, your subconscious will begin adding these in. You'll start getting more sensory details as you tell the story over and over, because the back of your brain wants to add details and make a story more interesting. It's just one of those natural things that human beings do. We always add on to stories and make them more interesting. And so that'll happen naturally. You can do it on purpose, but it'll happen on its own. But poetic language is usually fairly specific. If you think back to poetic language from someone like Homer, when Homer was talking about the Iliad and the Odyssey, he was talking about Greek warriors fighting a great war. All started by the kidnapping of a woman. But when he talked about things, he didn't just say the Greeks sailed across the ocean. He said the warriors sailed across the wine-dark sea. Now if you think of wine-dark, what color is wine usually when we think of wine? Yeah, usually kind of red. And if you think about warriors in a story, in a ship, sailing across an ocean that's red, what does that remind you of?
Blood.
Yeah, could definitely be blood from a battle. And so he doesn't say there was a bloody battle, but he says it's a wine-dark sea. And so either there's blood in the water right now, or there's going to be pretty soon. And so maybe it's the early sunrise, that red color from the early morning sun shining on the water. We don't know exactly. But the picture of a wine-dark sea paints a picture in your head right away. He also says, he doesn't say that the sun rose. He says that rosy-fingered dawn crept across the sky. That rosy-fingered dawn line is still stuck in my brain. I think I learned it in, 10th grade literature class or something like that. So that's the sort of language where you use just a few words to say something really interesting. And this is probably something you have to do intentionally with the story. But if there are just a few words that you want to add in, some different way of describing something, this is also a way to avoid cliches. Sometimes they'll say something as cold as ice. Well, everyone talks about that. And so try to think of something that's just a little bit different, as cold as a hole in the ground in the middle of January, or something like that. Those different uses of phrases can make a more interesting story for an audience. And if you can, even craft, none of us are Homer here, but crafting stories, lines that are just a little more interesting. And those tend to be lines that you memorize. Usually it's only 1 or 2 lines in a whole story, but they might be ones you memorize word for word because they're so well crafted and so interesting. One way to get familiar with some of these uses of poetic languages is to go back and read Homer, or read romantic poetry. Some of those romantic poets did a great job of describing with just a few words. There are a few modern poets too. If you like modern poetry, Billy Collins is a great poet to look at in terms of how he used his language.
Mary Oliver is wonderful.
Right, Mary Oliver, another great poet, yeah. And using just a few words to describe something big, and also sort of hinting at what's going on. So those are all good tools. Any questions about poetic language and how to add that in? What I'd like you to do next, then, is to tell a 2-minute version of your story. And I'd like you to add in 2 new sensory details that weren't in your story before. So 2 new sensory details that are not visual details. Does that make sense? So a sound, smell, touch, taste details. So make your story 2 minutes long and add 2 sensory details.